Hey there, Salam. This is intended to help you understand my notes and my scribblings on the PDF file that I sent you. If you haven't already done so, please look at, maybe even print out the Word document, which is a revised copy of what you sent me. I changed a little bit of the formatting, changed a few of the words, added a few little phrases here and there. Start with that when you make corrections. Do not start with the file that you sent me. Replace that file with the one that I sent you back. Also, probably print out the PDF file so that you can look at it while I'm doing this video and you can see what I'm talking about. First of all, good job on this job description. It's a very solid B, and not having had a lot of HR courses and talked about this kinds of thing, relying almost solely on the sample that I gave you, which I indicated in my video was nowhere near perfect. You've done a pretty good job with this. Let's talk through this thing real quick. First of all, the job summary is intended to be an executive summary sort of thing, that the candidate can look at this short paragraph to find out basically what this job does and then make a decision as to whether to keep reading or not. So what I'd like for you to do is reword that a little bit. To talk about what it does, look over your essential functions and summarize them into a few sentences. And you would probably want to say something to start with to the effect of, the inside sales associate is responsible for doing these things, interacting with customers who come into the store looking to purchase our flooring or our cabinetry or whatever, giving them good information. Summarize those essential functions. What is it that this job does in just a couple of sentences so that I know whether to keep reading or not. Under the essential functions, look at the big picture of what this is supposed to do. Sales, right? So the functions are providing information, creating a rapport, building relationships with people, trying to help answer their questions about what's right for them, showing them variations that they might consider, those kinds of things. Your essential functions, you've done pretty well on. A couple of things I would say that you need to address would be some vague wording or some general trite kinds of expressions. For example, consistently stay updated with the doings. That doesn't tell me much. Be more specific with that. Again, think about really what you want them to do and make sure that you've acknowledged here all of the things that they'll do frequently or the things that they might not do frequently but are very, very important for this job. I've changed a little bit of the wording, but there are some things in here that you'll see on this, like the hyphenated stress-free. I don't think I changed that. So add in these things to clarify. The next to last bullet point there, in order to ensure frequency. I had no idea what that meant. So expand on that a little bit, reword it, eliminate the last few words, those kinds of things. All right? But not a bad overall. Job context is not part of a lot of job descriptions that you'll see, but I wanted you to put it on this job description so that from an HR perspective, you would illustrate, you'd have practice thinking about the big picture of the job, being able to know enough about it to be able to interview people and answer their questions. So each one of these sections references a question that the candidate might ask. All right, supervision received, as it probably suggests, who do I report to? If I looked at an organizational chart, what job title is in the box right above mine? Who do I report to when I turn in time, when I ask for vacation, things like that? You've got a pretty good job there. You identify it's the sales manager. That's cool. But you want to also tell me if that person is in the office with me, if that person is in a different office that I won't see much, but I have to interact with on the phone, so forth. I wrote out into the margin frag. That's because always being available is a fragment sentence. I want you to reword that so that it is a complete sentence or it is a continuation of the sentence before that through the use of a comma or a semicolon or something like that. Available guidelines was off the mark. I think that the example that I gave you was wrong, but I indicated in my video that some things about that were not right, that you wanted to change before you submitted it, and I talked about that in that video. Available guidelines answers the question, if my boss is not here, where do I turn for help? And it typically is things like what manuals are there, what procedures and policies, what intranet sites, what websites, any of those kinds of things. So reword this paragraph to say, these are I don't know how to start the phrasing on it, but it basically has the context of these are the places that you can go for information if you have questions. When you have questions that you can't address with a supervisor or a colleague, we have reference materials available for you in the form of employee handbooks, policies and procedures manuals. intranet sites, those kinds of things. But again, the question that a candidate would have is, it's going to take me a while to learn this job. Where do I go when I have questions? That is the answer here. Accountability, part C, and consequence of error. You're on track there. It answers two questions, basically. If salesperson is in the process of doing those essential functions and does something wrong, what's it likely going to look like? Salespeople, you might sell them something they don't need or they didn't want. You may get too focused on commissions or whatnot and mislead them. You might know the right information and guess at it rather than looking it up. Those are things that could have consequences, right? Those are things that we need to make the employee accountable for. So list in this section, reword a little bit. You're pretty good on track already. What are the kinds of things that could go wrong? And then what are the consequences if they do? Before I even take this job, I want to understand if this is a job that has huge consequences if things go wrong, or if they're minor kinds of things that would tend to happen. The consequences for giving a customer wrong information is that I sell them the wrong thing, and then the company's got to go back and refund their money or something. That's a consequence, right? If I lie to people or I guess at things without checking and mislead them, it could tarnish our company's image, and I could end up terminated. Those are the kinds of things. You certainly say, depending on severity, we could have review boards. You've talked about fraudulent behavior, loss of customers, those kinds of things. You might not need to make any changes at all to this section, but look at the wording and see if you want to tweak anything. Personal contacts answers the question, who do I interact with and how frequently do I do it? In most jobs, there is interaction. There's some level of internal colleagues, managers, peers, other departments, things like that. But there's also usually some external contacts, customers, vendors, those kinds of things. You've done a pretty good job of identifying the people that I'll have to interact with. Make sure that you really focus too on when, all right? Daily basis, daily, once a month, once a quarter, daily. You've done a pretty good job with that. Another one of these sections that you might not have to change at all. Just think about it one more time from a big picture of who I'm going to have to interact with. I have changed a little bit the format, so leave the formatting alone. All right, supervision exercise answers the question, am I in charge of anybody else? And you've answered that, won't have any supervision role. But think about big picture long term. Will this person potentially be part of a training team that kind of informally has some supervision over new employees? Will they be a mentor to anybody as they grow in this position? What kinds of things could this develop into? So you might have a phrase that says, at this point you don't supervise anybody, but in the long term, these are the kinds of opportunities you might have to supervise or oversee other people. All right, physical demands answers the question, what kind of a toll is this going to take on my body? Do I have to lift things? How much? How far do I have to carry things? Do I stare at a computer for long periods of time? If so, how long? You've addressed most of that kinds of stuff. Instead of saying minimal lifting required, you might say infrequent, once a week or something like that. You might have to lift stuff, but typically it's less than 10 pounds, things like that. Be a little bit more specific with that. Work hazards. You probably want to reference that we comply with OSHA and things like that, but that's standard for everybody. You've indicated that the air conditioned, quiet work hazards are any kinds of things that could create stress problems or health problems for me. So loud noises, you've kind of addressed that. You've done better than most of your classmates on this section. I like the statement, nothing within the office can be considered a hazard unless used beyond its intended purposes. So you basically answer the question, really, there's not any significant hazards. But think about it one more time. It could be a work hazard if you have to deal with the yelling of an angry customer. So you might mention that, although it's very, very infrequent. Probably it's not a huge hazard when it does happen. The personal demands, do a little bit of work on it. It answers the question, how does this impact my relationships and things outside of work? May include long hours and weekend work, holidays not generally required. You address the basics of that. I would question whether the The inside sales associate would have to leave the building very frequently because the purpose of this is to deal with customers who come to us. So 10 to 15% of daily activity, I don't know. You might occasionally have some travel to go to meetings or conferences or things like that, or fill in for somebody at another store. But I would wonder if it's 10 to 15% of daily activities. That means that 10% is 80. 10% of an 8-hour day, which seems like an awful lot there. Compensation of travel, you might not need to put that in at all. No overnight. Typically it is by car, that kind of thing, pretty close. Knowledge, skills, abilities. Again, think about what you want them to do in your essential functions. What knowledge do you have to do that? What skills? Certainly personality is a skill, communication is a skill, memory is a skill, abilities, those kinds of things. Ability to capitalize on opportunities is really, really vague, so be more specific about that. Sit or stand for multiple hours, is that a skill? Is that a knowledge? Is that ability? You've already kind of addressed that in the physical demands and whatnot. Minimum qualifications, high school diploma or GED equivalent. Tell me if that is required or is it preferred? I would think that the GED high school is required. Under the experience, at least 1 to 2 years of sales and customer service. Remember, in the real world, this is probably legitimate, but we're interviewing college sophomores, and they may not have a year or two. So figure out how to reword this so that a college sophomore could apply for this job, because that's who your audience is for this particular project. Again, I agree that in the real world, you probably would want 2 years of experience, but for this assignment, maybe that's not practical. You may not have people who feel like they can apply. But again, tell me, is that required or is that preferred? That is critical. If it's required, I know right now that I can't do it. But if it's preferred, I can say, well, maybe they would still consider me even though I can't meet that expectation. Licenses, certificates, good. I've added a phrase down there at the bottom, and then you've got the conclusion there really well. Hope this gives you a good idea of what you ought to change to make this work right. Looking forward to seeing what you submit me. When you've made your changes to the document that I sent you, as I referenced earlier in the video, email it back to me, and I might make some tweaks to it. Probably when you send it back to me a second time, I don't need you anymore. I can make a little revisions here and there, but then we can load it to the website and be ready to go. If you have questions, email me or call me or whatever. Don't guess anything, but hopefully this video has really specifically addressed the things that I'd like you to do to get this presentable for the communications class. Good job.